In this podcast, we'll talk about the cases that fall under the topic of termination of offer. A few things to recall. A bilateral contract and a unilateral contract are different because they have different forms of acceptance. The form of acceptance of a bilateral contract is through a promise, whereby it is through performance for a unilateral contract. Recall that courts like to presume a bilateral contract because it protects parties' reasonable reliance. There can be unfair results with unilateral contracts. If you follow orthodox contract principles, an offeror of a unilateral contract can revoke the offer up until the last minute before complete performance, meaning a contract is only formed once the offeree fully performs. Now, we know that this comes into conflict with commercial reality, where the offer should be irrevocable while the offeree performs. And this takes us to the case of Arrington and Arrington Woods. The issue in this case is a unilateral offer revocable after performance begins? And the court decided that the offer could not be revoked once the offeree commences performance, but the offer ceases to bind the offeror if the offeree leaves the contract incomplete and unperformed. The reasons were that the plaintiff is under no obligation to perform the act, which is to pay the mortgage. So if she stops, there's no liability. But no contract will be formed, which is the contract would be the right to the house transfer, unless the contract is fully performed. Meaning, the offeror must allow the offeree the opportunity to fully perform. There is an implied promise that as long as they continue to perform, they would be allowed to remain in the possession of the house. Now, the question here is, how do you explain this principle that the offeror has the obligation not to revoke once performance has begun? After all, in unilateral contracts, completion of performance signals acceptance of the contract. Courts like to protect the offeree's reasonable reliance of a promise, but we found ways to do this. So first, remember from Dawson Helicopter Exploration, the court likes to presume a bilateral rather than a unilateral contract. The correspondence in Dawson contemplated performance by both parties. The commencement of performance by the offeree is the acceptance of the contract. So the offeror is not bound to pay until the act has been fully performed, but the offeror cannot revoke the offer because the offeree has already accepted it by commencing performance. Similarly, Arrington or his estate were not able to revoke the offer because the son and daughter-in-law had begun to make payments. If they failed to complete the payments, the father or his estate would be under no obligation to transfer the house. The second way to look at it is you could carefully construct the definition of act in the offer. In Carlisle, there were various interpretations of the offer. The act requested by the offer of the reward could be the acquisition of the smoke ball. It could be the acquisition of the smoke ball and the commencement of its use in accordance with the instructions, or it could be the completion of the course of treatment. Each interpretation has different levels of protection for the interests of the offeree. And if you exercise a narrow interpretation of the offer, it protects the offeree more. The last way of explaining it is the simplest. It's simply that the courts recognize that reasonable reliance on a promise is worthy of protection. It's the same result. It is the equivalent of holding that promisor cannot revoke the offer after performance starts. So, in the beginning of the semester, we said that the essence of contract law is the fulfillment of reasonable expectations. The law of contracts will, in many cases, protect expectations that are induced by the conduct of another. So we could even see this as a unilateral contract. The offeror saying, if you begin to perform the act that amounts to acceptance, I will not revoke the offer until you have had the opportunity to complete performing. How about holding the offer open before revocation? Now, in this case, Dickinson and Dodds, keep in mind one important thing. The knowledge the offeree received from the agent here was reliable. It could have been given by the offeror himself. In this case, the defendant Dodds gave a firm offer to sell the plaintiff Dickinson a residential property at a particular price. Dodds said the offer would be open until Friday, June 12th at 9. And on June 11th, Dodd's agent advised Dickinson that Dodds was negotiating to sell that property to another party. Dodd's agent then informed Dickinson that the party had been sold to another party. Nonetheless, Dickinson accepted the offer on June 12th. Dodd said that the acceptance was too late, so Dickinson brought the action to enforce the contract of sale. And the issue is the offeror bound by a, quote, firm offer, and does knowledge of a sale to a third party constitute revocation? Court determined that an offeror is not bound by his promise to keep the offer open once the offeree is aware that the offeror has sold to somebody else. Then he is then aware that the seller has not remained in the same mind to sell to him. And the reasons are that the offeror is under no obligation until the contract is formed. The offer can be withdrawn at any time. The offer is a mere nudum pactum, which is a bare agreement. It is not legally enforceable. And the offer that is made is dependent upon acceptance of the person to whom it is made. The other reason is that contract formation requires consensus ad idem. There is no consensus ad idem if the offeree knows of the sale to a third person. Now, how do you solve this problem? Well, you could contract for an option. And what this does is it requires the offeree to provide consideration in exchange for a promise to keep the offer open, a contractual obligation to keep the offer open for a specified period of time. This is often thought of as a unilateral contract, meaning if the optionee chooses to exercise the option, then she can do so by performing the required conditions. This can also be seen as a bilateral contract, whereas the optionor undertakes a promise to honor its terms if the option is exercised by the optionee, and the optionee is under no corresponding obligation to exercise the option. Another way that an offer can be terminated is through a lapse of time. Now, the duration of the offer may be limited by the offeror. Even if acceptance is demanded in an unreasonably short time, that's fine. If there's no limit specified, the power of acceptance expires after a reasonable time. And that depends on things like the subject matter of the transaction, whether the goods are perishable, whether there's a volatile market, what the practice of the trade is, if any, what the mode of communication was used by the offeror, and the offer may also lapse upon the occurrence of a certain condition, which you see in Barrick and Clark. In this case, the plaintiff offered to purchase on October 30th. The plaintiff requested the possession date of January 1st to March 1st. The plaintiff requested reply by telegram. The defendant counter-offered to sell by post on November 15th. The defendant counter-offered. In the counter-offer, the price slightly increased. The deal could be closed immediately, quote, trusting to hear from you as soon as possible, and the balance to be paid was to be paid on January 1st and clear title as well. And the present tenant's lease expires March 1st. Now, the plaintiff's wife received the defendant's letter in his absence on November 20th, and the wife wrote to the defendant indicating the plaintiff would return in 10 days. The wife asked the defendant to hold the offer open until the plaintiff's return. The defendant did not reply to the letter from the plaintiff's wife. The defendant offered to sell to a third party on November 30th, and the third party accepted the defendant's offer to sell on December 3rd. The plaintiff returned and wrote acceptance to the defendant on December 10th. The defendant received it on December 12th. The plaintiff sought a decree of specific performance. The issue here is, when will an offer lapse if there's no duration stipulated? And the ratio is, if there's no time stipulated, the offeree has a reasonable time in which to accept the offer. What constitutes reasonable? The nature and character, course of a business dealing leading up to the sale, circumstances of the offer, including the conduct of the parties. Here, there were a few factors the court looked at. Some factors indicated extended duration. So the market here was not volatile with respect to farmlands. In the ordinary course of business, a reasonable time for acceptance would be longer than that regarding commodities as shares of stock or goods of perishable characters. Second, some factors suggested limiting duration. First, there was a demand for this land. Second, the correspondence indicates that the defendant wanted the deal to close quickly. Quote, deal could be closed immediately. So what is reasonable depends on the offeror's presumed intentions.